In 1874, a buffalo hunter in the Texas Panhandle lined up a shot at a target he could barely see with the naked eye, and when he pulled the trigger, he knocked a mounted warrior clean off his horse from a distance so absurd that surveyors later measured it just to prove it happened. That shot became legend. Across 3 centuries of American fighting, from frontier trading posts to jungle river deltas, the story repeats itself. When the government could not supply the tool, the men on the ground built their own. Number 8 on this list started as a joke rigged from spare parts and ended up as an official government program still flying today. And number 1 is the longest confirmed rifle shot in the history of the American frontier, fired more than a century before anyone had a laser rangefinder to prove it. None of these 25 tools came from a factory drawing board. They came from a soldier, a sailor, or a hunter, staring at the fight in front of him and deciding the issued equipment simply was not going to be enough. Before we count them down, hit that subscribe button, because this channel exists to dig up the weapons history forgot. Let's begin with number 25. Number 25, the Quaker Gun. In the earliest days of the Civil War, Confederate defenders at Manassas held a long ridge with almost no real artillery to speak of. So engineers cut logs, charred the ends black with fire, and mounted them on wagon wheels to look like cannon from a distance. Union scouts glassing the ridge counted guns that were never there and reported a fortress the Confederacy did not actually have. It cost nothing but labor and bought weeks of hesitation from an enemy who outnumbered the real garrison many times over. It was not a weapon that fired a shot, but it won a standoff before a single real gun had to. The trick was repeated all along the Confederate line in the early months of the war whenever a position needed to look stronger than the men holding it actually were, and more than one Union advance stalled in front of guns that turned out to be nothing but timber and paint. Number 24, the tomahawk sidearm. Long before muskets could be reloaded fast enough to matter in close combat, frontier soldiers and militia fighting alongside colonial forces carried a light steel hatchet on the belt as a matter of course. When a flintlock misfired in the rain, or when fighting collapsed into the tangled brush where a long barrel was useless, the tomahawk came out. It could be thrown with accuracy at short range or swung in the hand, and it doubled as a camp tool for building a fire or clearing a trail. Soldiers who grew up on the frontier trusted it over the bayonet, because a hatchet never needed a reload and never fouled with black powder residue. It could also be traded, sharpened on any rock, and passed down from one campaign to the next, long after the musket that once rode beside it had been replaced twice over. Number 23, the buried land torpedo. Confederate General Gabriel Rains had experimented with victim-operated explosive traps years before the war, and once the fighting began in earnest, he pushed his engineers to bury artillery shells rigged with pressure fuses along roads and river approaches. Union soldiers advancing toward Yorktown and later toward Richmond stepped on devices that had no visible trigger and no warning, and the psychological effect outweighed even the casualties. It was controversial even among Confederate officers, some of whom considered it dishonorable, but it worked exactly as intended, forcing armies to slow down and probe every yard of ground they crossed. It stands as one of the direct ancestors of the modern landmine, and long after the war ended, military engineers on both sides studied what Rains had built in the field and folded the lessons into the formal doctrine that followed. Number 22, the conversion cartridge revolver. After the Civil War, thousands of soldiers and frontier lawmen were still carrying cap and ball revolvers that loaded loose powder and ball from the front of the cylinder, a slow and fussy process in a gunfight. Gunsmiths across the frontier, working out of small shops with hand tools, milled open the backs of old cylinders and fitted them to fire the new metallic cartridges that loaded in seconds. A soldier did not need to buy a new gun. He needed a smith willing to rework the one he already trusted. These converted revolvers armed everyone from cavalry troopers to town marshals for another 2 decades, stretched far past their intended service life by nothing more than a file, a lathe, and a steady hand in a shop that most towns on the frontier could not have functioned without. Number 21. The trench raiding mace. When American doughboys arrived in the trenches of the First World War, they found a kind of fighting no rifle drill had prepared them for. A raid across no man's land in the dark meant crawling into an enemy trench where a long rifle could not be swung and a gunshot would bring the whole line down on you. Soldiers on both sides built short clubs studded with nails or bolted with a piece of scrap iron on the head, small enough to carry on a raid and brutal enough to end a fight in one blow without a sound. American units picked up the practice quickly from the French and British troops beside them, and trench maces became almost as common in forward positions as the rifle itself, carried on the hip through the same mud and duck boards where a bayonet would only ever get in the way. Number 20. The jam tin bomb. Standard grenades were scarce in the first months American troops spent in the trenches, so soldiers built their own from whatever tin cans the mess hall threw out. A tin packed with black powder or captured explosive, mixed with nails, scrap metal, and broken glass for shrapnel, wired around a simple fuse, could clear a machine gun position almost as well as anything issued from the rear. It was crude, and it was dangerous to carry, since a jostled fuse in a muddy trench was a constant risk, but when the real grenades ran short, a jam tin bomb was better than an empty hand, and entire companies learned to build them by the crate load during the long stretches between resupply. Number 19. The ghillie camouflage sniper suit. The idea did not start with the American Army at all. It came from Scottish gamekeepers stalking deer decades earlier. But American marksmen serving in the trenches of the First World War and later in the Pacific adopted the concept out of pure necessity. Burlap strips, local foliage, and mud worked into a loose net over a uniform broke up the human silhouette in a way no issued uniform could. A sniper wearing one could lie motionless in open ground for hours while enemy patrols walked past without a second glance. It was never standard issue in the early years, built instead from sandbags and torn burlap by the men who needed to disappear into the landscape they were fighting in. Each suit slightly different because each man dressed it to match the exact patch of ground he expected to lie in for hours at a time. Number 18. The bootlegger drum magazine. During Prohibition, the Thompson submachine gun became infamous in the hands of criminal gangs who prized its 50-round drum magazine for the sheer volume of fire it offered in a street fight. Federal agents chasing those same gangs studied what worked against them and adopted the same drum magazines for their own weapons, reasoning that if the tool gave criminals an edge in a firefight, it would give lawmen the same edge back. It is one of the rare cases where the government borrowed a fighting innovation not from its own ranks, but from the men it was hunting, a detail that rarely makes it into the official telling of the Prohibition-era gun battles that followed. Number 17. The sawed-off pump shotgun of the Prohibition years. Federal Bureau of Prohibition agents and local police raiding stills and speakeasies often faced close-quarters fights in narrow hallways and cramped back rooms, where a rifle or a long shotgun was impossible to bring to bear. Officers cut the barrels of standard pump shotguns down to the legal minimum and sometimes past it, trading range for a wider spread and a weapon that could clear a doorway in one motion. It was against regulation more often than not, but in the raids that turned violent, the men carrying them rarely complained about the paperwork afterward, and more than one veteran agent credited the shortened barrel with the half-second that decided who walked out of a doorway first. Number 16. The Jeep-mounted machine gun. In the deserts of North Africa, American reconnaissance units found themselves facing fast-moving enemy patrols with vehicles that were never designed to fight. They were designed to scout and carry supplies. Crews welded pintle mounts onto the dashboard and rear deck of their Jeeps and bolted machine guns directly to the light frame, turning a scout vehicle into a strike vehicle in an afternoon. It let a 2 or 3 man crew put down a volume of fire that would have taken a full squad on foot, and the concept spread fast enough that similar armed Jeeps were still showing up in Korea years later, welded together in field workshops by crews who had never seen the original North African version, but arrived at almost the exact same design on their own. Number 15. The tank telephone rig. Infantry advancing alongside tanks in the hedgerows of Normandy faced a brutal communication problem. A tank crew buttoned up inside their armor could not hear a soldier shouting directions over the engine noise, and there was no reliable way to warn them about a hidden anti-tank gun around the next corner. Crews and infantry worked out a simple fix, mounting a field telephone in a box welded to the back of the tank, with a wire running inside to the crew compartment. A soldier walking behind the tank could pick up the handset and talk the driver through terrain the crew inside could not see, without ever exposing himself to climb up and bang on the hatch. A small fix that likely saved as many lives among the infantry escorts as any weapon on this entire list. Number 14. The satchel charge bunker clearing. On islands across the Pacific, American engineers and infantry ran into concrete bunkers and coral caves that shrugged off small arms fire entirely. The answer was blunt and effective. A canvas satchel packed with several pounds of explosive, carried forward under covering fire and either thrown through a firing slit or pressed against a door before the charge went off. It demanded the same kind of raw courage as the pole charges used elsewhere in the Pacific. A soldier closing the last few yards to a live bunker with a bag of explosives slung over his shoulder. But bunker by bunker, it was one of the few tools that actually worked, and engineer units on some islands went through their satchel charges faster than any other single piece of equipment they carried ashore. Number 13. The thermite spike. When American units overran an enemy artillery position faster than they could destroy it with demolition charges, engineers carried thermite grenades specifically to disable the guns left behind. Dropped into the breech or against the barrel, the burning thermite fused the metal parts together permanently, rendering the weapon useless without a single explosion that might draw enemy attention back to the position. It was quiet, it was fast, and it meant a captured gun stayed captured instead of being recovered and turned back around by a counterattack an hour later. Engineers carried the small thermite charges almost as a matter of habit whenever a unit overran an artillery position, treating it as routine as clearing a bunker or checking a foxhole. Number 12. The rifle grenade cup. Standard infantry rifles were never built to launch a grenade any real distance, so armorers fitted a simple metal cup over the muzzle that let a rifleman fire a grenade using a blank cartridge, sending it far beyond a hand throw. It turned an ordinary service rifle into a light mortar for a fraction of the weight and cost, giving a single infantryman the reach to hit a machine gun nest or a stubborn position from well outside grenade-throwing range. The adapter was cheap enough to issue widely, and squads that carried a few of them gained a punch that used to require a heavier weapon entirely, letting a handful of riflemen do the job that would otherwise have called for a mortar crew and the extra weight that came with it. Number 11. The spider hole sniper nest. In the dense cover of Pacific Islands, American marksmen learned that height was less valuable than invisibility. Rather than climbing into a tree where a silhouette stood out against the sky, snipers dug narrow pits at ground level, roofed with a thin layer of dirt and foliage, leaving only enough space to see and fire through a slit. A patrol could walk within a few feet of a spider hole and never know it was there. It was slow, patient work to dig and camouflage properly, but a well-built spider hole let one man hold a stretch of jungle trail for hours against anyone who did not know exactly where to look. And stories circulated of patrols walking directly over an occupied hole without a single man in the column noticing. Number 10. The unexploded ordnance mine. Battlefields across both world wars were littered with artillery shells that had failed to detonate on impact, and engineers on the American side learned to see those duds not as hazards to avoid, but as raw material. Carefully recovered and rigged with a fresh pressure fuse, a dud shell became a ready-made mine with far more explosive power than anything a soldier could carry and assemble by hand. It was dangerous work handling ordnance that had already partially armed itself, but it meant a battlefield's own leftover firepower could be turned into a defensive line without waiting on a single new shell from the rear, essentially letting a unit arm itself from the wreckage the enemy had already fired at them. Number 9. The salvaged PIAT. During the airborne assault at Arnhem, American paratroopers fighting alongside British forces found themselves desperately short of anti-tank weapons as German armor closed in. When British soldiers fell, some of the surviving Americans picked up their PIAT launchers, a spring-loaded anti-tank weapon completely unlike anything in the American arsenal, and figured out how to cock and fire it under fire with no formal training on the system at all. It was clumsy and physically brutal to operate, but against armor that would otherwise have rolled straight through the position, an unfamiliar weapon in a determined soldier's hands beat no weapon at all. Number 8. The oil filter suppressor. Special operations soldiers working deep in enemy territory during the Vietnam War needed a way to fire a pistol without giving away their position to every enemy patrol within a mile. Armorers built crude sound suppressors from automotive oil filters, packing the housing with baffles and steel wool to slow and cool the escaping gas before it could crack loudly at the muzzle. It was never as refined as a factory-built suppressor, but for a reconnaissance team trying to eliminate a single sentry in silence, it did exactly what it needed to. The concept proved useful enough that it directly influenced the design of official suppressors issued to special units in the years that followed. Number 7. The cut-down tunnel rat revolver. American soldiers assigned to clear the tunnel networks dug beneath Vietnam faced fighting in total darkness and spaces barely wide enough to crawl through, where a full-length rifle was completely useless. Many tunnel rats carried personal revolvers, sometimes brought from home, with the barrels cut down to a few inches so the weapon could be drawn, aimed, and fired in a space too tight to extend an arm fully. It traded range and accuracy for something far more valuable underground: the ability to bring a weapon to bear in the half-second a soldier actually had before an ambush in the dark. Number 6. The sawed-off pirate gun. Standard grenade launchers issued to American infantry in Vietnam were long enough to be awkward in the thick brush and tight village alleys many patrols fought through. Some soldiers had armorers cut the stock and barrel down to little more than a pistol grip and a stub of tube, trading accuracy at range for a weapon that could be carried and swung fast in close terrain where most contacts happened at a few dozen feet anyway. It earned an unofficial nickname among the men who carried it, and while it was never an approved modification, plenty of officers looked the other way when it clearly worked. Number 5. The grenade spoon quick charge. Combat engineers and infantry in Vietnam often needed to destroy a bunker or a cache immediately, without the minutes it took to properly time a demolition charge with a timed fuse. Soldiers learned to tape a block of plastic explosive directly to a hand grenade, with the spoon held down by the tape itself, so that pulling the pin and throwing the combined charge gave a demolition blast on the same short fuse as an ordinary grenade. It sacrificed the safety margin of a proper timed charge for speed that mattered when a patrol needed to blow something and move immediately. Number 4. The gunship built from a cargo plane. Facing enemy positions that could melt away into jungle cover before a fighter jet could line up a second pass, air crews in Vietnam took an aging cargo transport plane never designed for combat and mounted rapid-fire machine guns along one side, flying a tight circle so the guns could pour fire onto a single point on the ground for as long as fuel allowed. Ground troops under siege at night called it in and watched a stream of tracer fire pour down like a solid beam of light. What started as an improvised experiment worked so well it became an official program, and heavily armed gunships built on the same idea are still flown by American forces today. Number 3. The armored riverboat.
Patrol boats running the rivers and canals of Vietnam were built for speed, not protection, and crews taking fire from both banks at close range had almost nothing to hide behind. Sailors welded scrap steel plate and stacked sandbags around the wheelhouse and gun positions, adding weight the boats were never designed to carry, in exchange for a chance of surviving an ambush at point-blank range. It slowed the boats down and strained engines that were already working hard against the current, but crews who had been shot at in an unarmored hull did not need convincing that the trade-off was worth it. Number 2. The field-scoped battle rifle. Long before any formal marksmanship program caught up to the demand, American scout snipers in Vietnam mounted commercial hunting scopes onto standard infantry rifles, hand-fitting brackets and zeroing the optics in the field with nothing more than a steady rest and a known distance to a target. Men who had grown up hunting deer and elk back home brought that same patient eye for wind and range into a war where a single accurate shot could hold a trail crossing for an entire platoon. These field-built rifles armed some of the most effective marksmen of the war before the official rifles and scopes ever reached them. Number 1. Billy Dixon's long shot at Adobe Walls. In 1874, a small group of buffalo hunters and traders held out against a much larger force of mounted warriors laying siege to their trading post in the Texas Panhandle. On the third day of the standoff, hunter Billy Dixon borrowed a heavy buffalo rifle chambered for a massive .50 caliber cartridge, built for dropping bison at long range rather than for combat, and fired a single shot at a mounted figure so far away that most of the men around him could barely make out a rider at all. The shot struck home and knocked the warrior from his horse, and the distance was later measured by Army surveyors at roughly 1,538 yards, nearly a mile. It remains one of the longest confirmed rifle shots in frontier history, fired with open iron sights, no rangefinder, and no formal military training behind the trigger. A hunting tool turned into a legend by one man's steady hand at exactly the right moment. From a charred log painted to look like a cannon to a buffalo rifle that made history by accident, these 25 weapons share the same origin story. Somewhere along the way, the tools that were issued were not enough for the fight in front of them, and the men holding the line filled the gap themselves, with scrap metal, stolen ideas, and whatever was already sitting in the supply tent. Most of these innovations were never written into any manual. They lived and died with the units that built them, remembered only by the handful of men who carried them into a fight the official arsenal was not ready for. Which one of these surprised you the most? Tell me in the comments, and if you want more forgotten history like this, dug up and laid out plainly, you know exactly what to do.